The rotors came first. A low, thunderous vibration that rattled the windows of Mercy General Hospital at 2:47 in the morning. Not the polite hum of a news helicopter, not the soft whir of a medevac. This was something heavier, something military. On the third floor, every nurse froze. Doctors pressed their faces to rain-streaked glass. Confusion etched across their tired features. The ward clerk stood up from her desk. Even the machines seemed to hold their breath between beeps. And then they saw it. A Black Hawk helicopter. Matte black. No markings. No news logo. No hospital affiliation. Descended out of the dark sky and settled onto the helipad with the terrifying precision of a bird that had landed in far more dangerous places than a hospital roof. The landing gear touched down. The rotors slowed. For figures in military tactical gear stepped out. They didn't run. They didn't look confused. They walked like people who had already decided what was going to happen next. The head of the group, a tall man with a jaw that looked carved from stone and eyes that swept the environment the way a weapon sweeps a room, pushed open the rooftop access door and moved directly to the third-floor nursing station. He didn't ask for the chief of medicine. He didn't ask for Richard Calloway, who owned this hospital and whose portrait hung in the lobby. He didn't ask for the head of surgery or the department director or any of the credentialed, white-coated figures of authority who were watching him with their mouths slightly open. He asked for one name, a name that nobody on this ward, not the nurses, not the residents, not the senior attending physicians, had ever associated with anything other than the quiet, unremarkable woman who refilled 4 bags and charted vitals in the corner. He asked for Sparrow, and for just a moment, the entire floor went absolutely silent, because nobody in that hospital knew that name. It wasn't on any badge. It wasn't in any personnel file. It wasn't something that had ever come up in conversation, not over lunch, not during shift handoffs, not in the break room where staff sometimes talked about their lives before medicine. Nobody knew the name Sparrow, except one person. She was standing 40 feet away at the medication cart, her back turned, her dark hair pulled into a simple knot, her scrubs exactly as plain and forgettable as they always were. She didn't gasp. She didn't drop anything. She didn't react with shock or fear. She simply closed the medication drawer, turned around slowly, and met the soldier's eyes with a calm that made every other person in that hallway feel like they had been standing in the presence of someone they had never actually seen. "That's me," she said quietly, and everything changed. But to understand what happened next, you need to understand what happened before. What nobody at Mercy General knew. What even the man who owned this hospital couldn't have imagined when he looked at this woman and decided she was beneath him. You need to understand who Maya Torres actually was. If you passed Maya Torres in the hallway of Mercy General, you would not remember her. That wasn't an insult. It was simply the truth, and in a way it was a skill she had spent years perfecting. She was 36 years old, medium height, with olive skin and dark eyes that registered everything without advertising the fact. She wore the same plain navy scrubs every shift. She kept her name badge tucked neatly, always straight, always professional. She smiled when patients needed it, nodded when doctors spoke over her, and never, not once in the 18 months she had worked the night shift at Mercy General, had she given anyone a reason to ask a deeper question about her. She was, to every observer in that hospital, simply the quiet night nurse. She arrived early. She left late. She never called in sick. She knew every patient's chart with a fluency that impressed the residents, though they rarely said so out loud, and her hands were, according to more than one attending physician who'd noticed without remarking, the steadiest hands on the floor. But there were things, small things, details that didn't quite add up, if anyone had ever stopped to add them. The way she moved, for instance. Not fast, not slow, but with a kind of deliberateness, a word chosen carefully here, that reminded you of someone who had once learned, in a very permanent way, that wasted movement could cost lives. She didn't pace. She didn't wander. Every step she took in that hospital had a destination, and her eyes never stopped cataloging the space around her even when the rest of her face was completely still. There was the incident early in her employment, when a man on the 4th floor had a syncopal episode in the hallway and went down hard. Every other nurse on the floor had a half-second of freeze, that involuntary pause the human brain takes when something unexpected detonates in your peripheral vision. Maya was already moving before the man hit the floor. Not running. Moving. The distinction matters. Running is panic. What she did was controlled, targeted, and precise. She was at his side, had his airway, and had already begun her assessment before the first overhead page went out. Nobody said much about it. She deflected the brief attention with a small shrug and something about nursing instinct. But it wasn't nursing instinct. There was also the matter of the scar. A long, pale ridge that ran along the inside of her left forearm, visible only when her sleeves rolled up during a particularly demanding procedure. One of the residents asked about it once, casually, the way young residents ask about things they haven't yet learned to be delicate about. Maya glanced at it the way most people glance at something they have made peace with a very long time ago. "Old injury," she said, and moved on. It wasn't a lie. She rented a small apartment 12 minutes from the hospital. Her neighbors knew her as someone quiet and polite who sometimes ran before sunrise at a pace that made joggers do double takes. Her apartment, had anyone ever seen the inside, contained very little. Clean surfaces, organized shelves, a first aid kit that contained items no standard first aid kit should contain. Books, not romance novels or hospital dramas, but dense volumes on field medicine, emergency trauma protocols, and one weathered manual with no title on its spine that she had never left behind in 17 years of carrying it. She had no social media presence. None. In an age where even the hospital's janitorial staff had Instagram accounts, Maya Torres existed online as a ghost. A name attached to an employee record and a professional nursing license, and nothing more. She had one photograph on her phone, a group of people in desert terrain, squinting against a sun that belonged to a place far from here, their arms around each other in the easy way of people who have been through something together that civilians don't fully have words for. She was on the far left of the photo, younger, hair cropped shorter, wearing something that was distinctly not scrubs. She never showed anyone the photo. And in the 18 months she worked at Mercy General, Maya Torres was asked exactly 0 times about her life before nursing. Not because people were cruel, but because she had perfected the art of seeming like a person who had simply always been here, always been quiet, always been competent, always been easy to overlook. She had, after all, survived far more terrifying things than being overlooked. She had learned, in the dust and blood and screaming chaos of places whose names she no longer said out loud, that the most dangerous person in any room was never the loudest one. She had learned it the hard way, and she had never forgotten it. Mercy General Hospital was, on paper, one of the finest medical facilities in the state. It had gleaming floors and a newly renovated atrium and a cafeteria that offered 4 kinds of artisan coffee and a rotating menu of options that a nutritional consultant had been hired, at significant expense, to design. The lobby featured a waterfall wall. The parking structure had been featured in an architectural magazine. The hospital's website listed 17 departments and 43 centers of excellence. Whatever that meant. What the website did not list was Richard Calloway. Not because he was hidden, quite the opposite. His name was on a plaque in the lobby, embossed in brass, positioned at eye level so that everyone who entered the building would see it. His portrait hung in the executive suite corridor, rendered in oils in the style of a man who had commissioned his own portrait and approved 3 different drafts before settling on the one that made his jaw look most decisive. Richard Calloway was the kind of man who had always had money, and who had long ago confused having money with deserving things. He was 51, silver-haired, and possessed of the particular brand of confidence that comes not from competence but from having spent a lifetime in rooms where no one had ever told him he was wrong. He was not a doctor. He held a business degree and an MBA and an impressive collection of opinions about medicine that he delivered freely to the people who actually practiced it. He wore custom suits to the hospital. He visited the floors quarterly, not to listen but to be seen, and he moved through the wards with the proprietorial energy of a man walking through a building he owned, which, technically, he did. The staff had developed a vocabulary for his visits. Calloway's on the floor, a nurse would murmur, and the information would ripple outward like a stone dropped in still water. A tightening here, a straightening there. A subtle shift in the atmosphere that had nothing to do with patient care and everything to do with performance. People smiled differently when Calloway was watching. Residents stood a little taller. Attendings chose their words more carefully. Maya Torres was, as far as anyone could tell, the only person on staff who did not adjust her behavior when Calloway appeared. Not from defiance. From indifference, which is actually more powerful. She simply continued doing what she was doing, charting, checking, adjusting, monitoring, with the same unhurried precision she brought to every other moment of her shift. If Calloway passed her, she gave a professional nod and returned to work. She did not perform. She did not become invisible. She simply remained, quietly and completely, herself. This, it turned out, was something Richard Calloway noticed. He didn't like it. The night shift at Mercy General had its own ecosystem, separate and apart from the day shift's bustle. The hallways were quieter. The lighting was lower. The admissions slowed. The patients who were awake at 3 a.m. were either in pain or afraid or both, and the staff who worked those hours developed a particular kind of attentiveness, a radar for small changes that hadn't yet registered on monitors, a sensitivity to the space between what a patient said and what they meant. Maya was extraordinary at this. Not in any showy way. In the way of someone whose instincts had been forged under conditions that made hospital vigilance look gentle by comparison. She noticed things. She noticed when a patient's breathing rhythm shifted in ways the pulse oximeter hadn't caught yet. She noticed when a family member hovering in a doorway needed someone to say the honest thing, not the careful thing. She noticed when a resident was making a decision based on what they wanted the chart to say rather than what the patient's body was actually doing, and she would ask a quiet question, just one, phrased carefully, that redirected the conversation without ever making the resident feel challenged. The residents, for their part, had learned to listen to her without quite knowing why. The attending physicians had not all reached the same conclusion. Some of them, the good ones, had noticed that her instincts were unusual and her assessments were reliable. Others saw what the hospital's hierarchy encouraged them to see. A night nurse, a support role, a function. The tension in the building wasn't always visible, but it was always there. It lived in the way certain doctors spoke to nursing staff. Not cruelly, not always, but with a casual dismissiveness that accumulated like sediment. It lived in the break room conversations about which attending had been condescending today, in the way younger nurses learned to absorb it and older nurses had learned to survive it. It lived in the performance evaluations that praised technical competence while measuring it against metrics that had been designed by people who had never worked a night shift. And it lived, most visibly, in the way Richard Calloway moved through this building, as though the people who kept it running were props in a set he owned. He had never truly looked at Maya Torres. He was about to. He was about to look at her very closely, and say things that he would spend a long time wishing he hadn't. And those words would still be hanging in the air of that corridor when the Black Hawk helicopter broke the silence of a September night like a fist through glass. But the helicopter was still hours away. First came the incident. It began, as crises so often do, with a request that seemed routine. Senator Alan Marsh had been admitted to Mercy General's executive suite 2 days earlier, officially for what the press release called scheduled cardiac monitoring. The unofficial version, the one that moved through the hospital in whispers, was closer to the truth. The senator had nearly collapsed at a fundraising dinner, his blood pressure had reached numbers that frightened his security detail, and his physician had insisted on admission immediately. He was 64 years old, politically powerful, and exactly the kind of patient that hospitals like Mercy General quietly reorganized themselves around. His room had been upgraded. His meals had been catered. His nursing assignments had been shuffled to ensure he received the most credentialed available staff during day hours. At night, however, the executive suite fell into the third floor's jurisdiction, and the third floor's night shift belonged to Maya. She had cared for Senator Marsh for 2 nights without incident. He was demanding in the way of men who had spent decades having demands met, but he was not unkind. She had assessed his vitals with the same thoroughness she applied to every patient, had noted a particular pattern in his evening blood pressure readings that she had flagged to the attending cardiologist during handoff, and had been told, politely but conclusively, that the specialist had already reviewed his metrics and the monitoring protocol would continue as planned. She had written her note. She had flagged her concern. She had done what the system allowed. She remained watchful. On this third night, Richard Calloway arrived at the hospital at 9 p.m. Unusual for him, but the senator's presence had been drawing more frequent visits from the owner, who understood political capital in the way he understood all currencies, with great attentiveness. Calloway moved through the executive suite with his personal assistant 2 steps behind him, greeting the senator with the ease of a man who had practiced warmth until it became reflexive. They spoke for 40 minutes. When he emerged, he was in the particular good mood of a man who had successfully performed himself. And then he saw Maya. She was at the nursing station just outside the suite, updating the senator's evening chart, her handwriting precise, her notes detailed, her attention completely on the page in front of her. She did not look up when he approached. "Excuse me." His voice had that quality, the one that expected the room to reorganize itself in response. "Why does this patient's evening chart show a flagged notation from last night that hasn't been addressed?" Maya looked up. She assessed him with the kind of glance that took in everything without revealing anything. "It was addressed, sir. I raised the observation to Dr. Kellerman during morning handoff. It's documented." Dr. Kellerman said the monitoring protocol is adequate. "Yes, I agree with following the protocol. I simply noted the trend for completeness." Calloway looked at her badge, looked at her scrubs, looked at her with the full inventory of a man cataloging what he considered a lesser element of his operation. "What's your name?" "Maya Torres. I'm the night charge nurse for this floor." "Well, Maya Torres, night charge nurse." He let the title hang in his mouth for a moment, like something he was deciding whether to swallow. "I want to be very clear about something. The senator is being cared for by one of this hospital's top cardiologists. He does not need a night nurse second-guessing his care plan and creating paperwork anxiety in a sensitive patient's file." Maya said nothing. She held his gaze steadily. "Do you understand medicine?" Calloway continued. "Do you have a medical degree? Because the people who do have made their assessment. Your job is to follow the protocol, not write editorial notes that might alarm a high-profile patient who happens to look at his own chart." Around them, the floor had gone quiet. A resident was pretending to review a tablet. 2 nurses at the far end of the station were very still. The ward clerk had stopped typing. Everyone was hearing this. Furthermore, he looked her over again with that same appraising, dismissive sweep. "This is a high-visibility floor. I'd expect staff up here to present accordingly." He gestured vaguely at her plain scrubs, her simple appearance, her complete absence of the kind of polish he associated with adequacy. "We have certain standards." And there it was. Not a question, not a critique of her work. A statement about her appearance, made publicly in front of her colleagues, by a man who had never spent a single night ensuring anyone's survival. Maya Torres did not flush. She did not blink rapidly or look away or do any of the things that embarrassment produces in people who have been caught off guard. She looked at Richard Calloway with an expression so steady and so neutral that the resident with the tablet later described it as unnerving. Not because it was cold, but because it was so completely unbothered. "I understand," she said. "Is there anything else you need, sir?" He looked at her for a moment longer, seemingly dissatisfied that she had not crumbled. "Just do your job," he said, and walked away. The floor breathed again. Maya turned back to her chart. She wrote 2 more lines in her notation. Then she walked to Senator Marsh's room to conduct his 9:30 vitals check. His blood pressure was higher than the previous 2 evenings. His breathing pattern had shifted, not dramatically, not in a way that would trip a monitor alarm, but in a way that Maya's body recognized before her mind fully processed it. She had seen this before. Not in a hospital. In a place with no equipment, no clean floors, no attending physicians down the hall. A place where this particular cluster of signals had meant one thing. She picked up the room phone. At 9:47 p.m., Senator Alan Marsh's heart went into ventricular fibrillation. At 9:47 and 30 seconds, Maya Torres had already initiated the code. What happened next was 38 minutes of controlled, urgent, relentless medical intervention. The crash cart arrived. Residents appeared. Dr. Kellerman was paged and arrived in 8 minutes in a state of barely suppressed alarm. The attending team took over the code, as they should, and Maya stepped back as she should and ran the periphery. Medications accurately drawn and delivered before they were finished asking for them. A second 4-access established before anyone thought to request it. Monitoring leads replaced and organized before they could tangle. When the team finally stabilized the senator, when his rhythm returned to something livable and the room's collective exhale happened, Dr. Kellerman looked up from the bed and found Maya resetting the crash cart with the efficient calm of someone performing a task she had performed many times before. "Good catch," he said. "It was inadequate." He seemed to know it. Maya nodded and continued resetting the cart. Richard Calloway had been watching from the hallway. He hadn't said anything for 38 minutes. He did not say anything now. But the floor had only a moment to process what had happened. A moment to feel the specific discomfort of having watched the woman who had just been publicly humiliated turn around and potentially save a man's life, before the sound arrived. Distant at first, then close, then overhead. The unmistakable thunder of a military helicopter descending from the night sky. The man who led the 4-person team introduced himself to no one. He moved directly to the nursing station, his bearing carrying the absolute certainty of someone who had never needed to prove his authority in a room. It simply preceded him like a change in air pressure. The tactical gear he and his team wore was military-grade, unmarked, the kind of equipment that didn't appear in public press releases. He held a sealed document in one hand and a radio in the other, and his eyes conducted the same sweep of the space that Maya's did, the sweep of someone trained to assess environments, not admire them. "I'm looking for a medic who goes by Sparrow," he said. "Not a nurse. Not a doctor. A medic." The ward clerk opened her mouth and closed it. One of the residents looked at another resident. Dr. Kellerman stepped forward, professionally, because a man of his standing did not simply stand aside. "This is a hospital. If you're here with a patient—" "I'm not here with a patient." The soldier's voice was not unkind, but it was absolutely immovable. "I'm here for Sparrow. Combat flight medic, 160th SOAR attachment. 2 tours. We have a situation and we need her." Silence. Then, from 40 feet away, a voice. "That's me." Maya Torres set down the chart she was updating. She turned around, and she looked at the soldier, this man who had just spoken a language that no one else on this floor understood, with an expression of recognition so quiet and so complete that it was almost intimate. The soldier looked at her. Something passed between them that civilians don't have a precise word for, the specific acknowledgement of people who have survived things together, or alongside each other, in the taxonomy of a world that exists parallel to this one. "Torres." A single nod. "Reeves." She nodded back. Richard Calloway was still in the hallway. He had not left after the code. Some gravitational uncertainty had kept him there. The discomfort of a man who had said something ugly and then watched the person he'd said it to perform something remarkable, who was not quite sure how to exit the scene with his sense of himself intact. He watched this exchange with an expression that was changing in real time. "Torres," the soldier Reeves said, "we have a classified trauma situation. High-value personnel, multiple casualties, 1 critical. The regular medical teams have been compromised. Command requested you specifically." "What's the nature of the injury?" "Blast trauma, penetrating, multisystem, unstable." The surgical team on site was... He paused almost imperceptibly, the pause of someone choosing words around information that had a classification level, taken out of the picture. Maya absorbed this. Her face did not change, but something behind her eyes shifted. A quality of attention becoming sharper, more focused, the way a lens sharpens when the subject comes into focus. "I need 5 minutes," she said. "You have 3. She turned to the nursing station. "Chan," she said to the nurse at the adjacent station. "Take over my patients. I'm documenting the handoff now." She began typing with the same unhurried precision she always brought to her charts, because patients did not stop needing care because the world had become strange, because the vitals still needed checking, because that was what you did. You completed the task in front of you. It was Dr. Kellerman who finally said it. He had been standing very still since the soldier arrived, and physicians of his standing are not often very still. "Torres, what exactly is going on? What is he talking about? A combat flight medic?" Maya finished her documentation. She looked up, And she did something she had not done in 18 months at this hospital. She answered a personal question honestly. Before I was a nurse here, I was a flight medic with the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment. I served 2 combat tours. My last deployment was classified. I left the service 4 years ago. She paused. I was good at it. The understatement of it landed in the room like a stone dropped into water. Ripples. Kellerman stared at her. You were a military medic. Among other things. And you've been working a night shift here for 18 months. Yes. There was no apology in her voice. There was nothing defensive. She said it the way a person states a fact about the weather. She was already moving toward the rooftop access. She had changed. Not her clothing, not yet, but something in the architecture of how she carried herself. Like a gear shift so subtle you almost didn't catch it. The person who had been standing at the medication cart 10 minutes ago was the same person, but now you could see what had always been underneath. Not hidden exactly, but simply not on display for an audience that hadn't known to look. In the hallway, Richard Calloway was very still. His face had passed through several stages since the helicopter had arrived, and it had now arrived somewhere that didn't have a comfortable name. He had publicly questioned this woman's competence and her appearance and her place in his hospital. He had done it in front of her colleagues. He had done it with the full confidence of a man who owned the building. And now he was watching her be recalled by the United States military for a mission that the doctors he paid hundreds of thousands of dollars a year would not be asked to perform. A mission that required her specifically. By name. By call sign. A call sign she had earned in places where the cost of incompetence was measured in lives. He didn't speak. At the rooftop door, Maya Torres paused. She looked back down the hallway. Not at Calloway, not at the doctors, not at anyone in particular. Then she pushed through the door, and the sound of the Black Hawk's rotors swallowed her whole. The classified situation was worse than Reeves had described. Maya understood this before they landed. The radio communication during the flight was clipped and procedural, the language of people managing catastrophe by refusing to give it adjectives, but she could read the gaps, the pauses, the way a particular number of seconds passed between certain transmissions. She had learned to read those gaps in the mountains of Afghanistan, in the bleeding dark of a Humvee that had taken an IED hit, in the chaos of extraction operations where the information you needed was always slightly behind the situation you were in. She said very little on the flight. She reviewed the briefing document Reeves handed her. She organized the field kit they had brought for her with hands that operated independently of conscious thought. Muscle memory so deep it lived in her bones. Assembling, checking, setting aside what she didn't need, prioritizing what she did. Reeves watched her from across the cabin. You look different, he said. Same person, she said, without looking up from the kit. You know what I mean. She did know. The hospital was a place where she had arranged herself for civilians. Competent, present, but compressed. This was what she was when she wasn't compressing. She was not more aggressive. Not louder. Simply completely and unambiguously herself. The quality that Mercy General staff had perceived as quietness was not quietness. It was precision. And precision, without the need to soften itself for a civilian setting, looks like something else entirely. The site was a fortified location 40 miles from the city. A compound that didn't appear on public maps, staffed by people who didn't appear in public records. 3 casualties. 1 critical. A penetrating abdominal trauma from a fragmentation device, complicated by a hemorrhagic pattern that the on-site medical officer, who had been caught in the same blast, had managed to slow but not stop before being evacuated herself. Maya stepped off the helicopter into controlled chaos. She assessed the critical patient in 30 seconds. Not because she was careless, but because 30 years of evolution had given human beings only so many ways to be critically injured, and she had seen all of them, and her brain had long ago built a triage system that operated at a speed that looked, to outside observers, like some kind of preternatural calm. Tell me his pressure history in the last 20 minutes, she said, not looking up from her examination. The soldier beside her, young, trying very hard to project composure, rattled off numbers. Blood type confirmed? Oh, negative. What do I have for vascular access? 2 large-bore IVs, 1 central line. She was already moving. She called for specific items in specific order, and the team around her responded with the precise, high-speed cooperation of people who had trained for exactly this. For the moment when someone walked in and knew what they were doing, and all you had to do was follow at the same speed. The intervention she performed in the next 41 minutes had a name that would appear in a classified after-action report. The layman's version. She stopped a man from bleeding to death with the combination of field surgical skills, pharmacological intervention, and improvisational resourcefulness that is the exclusive product of having done this in conditions that would have made the procedure impossible, and doing it anyway and surviving to do it again. There was a moment, somewhere around minute 23, when the patient's pressure dropped to a number that made the young soldier's face go white. Maya did not go white. She made 2 adjustments in quick succession, called for one specific medication at one specific dose, repositioned her hands, and continued. Her breathing was steady. Her voice, when she spoke, was the voice of a person narrating a task, not managing a catastrophe. That specific skill, that ability to remain cognitively clear while everything peripheral is trying to drag you into panic, is not taught in nursing school. It is not taught in any school. It is forged in the kind of experiences that most people will spend their entire lives successfully avoiding. At minute 41, the patient's numbers stabilized. Reeves exhaled. Around the room, other people exhaled. The young soldier, who had been standing very still, sat down on a crate and pressed his hands to his knees. Maya Torres straightened up. She stripped her gloves. She reviewed the stabilization protocol she wanted maintained during transport, conveyed it with crystalline clarity to the medic who would travel with the patient, and checked it twice. Then she stood back. And in the sudden, exhausted quiet of a mission that had gone from catastrophic to survivable, she looked, as she always looked, like someone who had simply done the work in front of her. Not a hero, not performing anything, just a person who knew what to do and did it, and now the next thing would begin. Reeves looked at her across the room. "I'll put in the commendation," he said. "You don't have to," she said. "I know," he said. "I'm going to." The helicopter flew her back to Mercy General at dawn. The sun was coming up over the city, painting the hospital's glass facade in shades of copper and gold. From the helipad, she could see the emergency entrance below, the parking structure, the lobby with its waterfall wall. She took a breath of morning air. Then she walked back inside and clocked back in for the remainder of her shift. Richard Calloway was waiting. Not in the way of a man who had been standing there for hours with prepared words, in the way of a man who had not been able to leave, who had remained in the hospital through the night, in the corridor near the nursing station, because leaving felt worse than staying and he couldn't entirely explain why. He looked, by the time Maya walked back through the door, like a man who had spent several hours alone with himself. It is an experience that does not suit everyone. She saw him when she came off the elevator. She registered his presence with the same calm economy with which she registered everything, and continued toward the nursing station to resume her handoff notes, because the shift did not pause for personal drama. He came to her. "Ms. Torres." She looked up. "I owe you an apology." He said it simply, not with the performative contrition of a man managing his image. With something that looked genuinely like a man who had revised his understanding of a situation and found his previous behavior in it embarrassing. "What I said last night was inappropriate. It was dismissive and it was wrong. The work you do, what you did last night here and apparently—" He gestured vaguely at the ceiling, at the sky, at the direction from which helicopters arrived. "I had no idea who you were." Maya looked at him for a moment. "With respect, sir," she said quietly, "you shouldn't have needed to know who I was. You spoke to me the way you did before you had any idea what I was capable of. Which means the problem wasn't ignorance of my background. It was something else." He held her gaze. He was not a man who was often spoken to this directly by anyone. He absorbed it. "You're right," he said. And it was 3 words, but they cost him something, and she could see that they cost him something, and she respected the paying of it even if she did not particularly need it. Around them, the morning staff was beginning to arrive. People were watching without watching, the specific sideways attention of professionals who are absolutely paying attention but maintaining the fiction of not doing so. Dr. Kellerman had arrived for morning rounds. He stopped when he saw the exchange. He met Maya's eyes across the nursing station, and he gave her a nod. Not the professional nod of a superior to a subordinate, but something leveler. Something more honest. Senator Marsh, who had been stabilized through the night and would make a full recovery, had sent a handwritten note to the nurse's station. The ward clerk read it aloud quietly. It said simply, "I'm told there was a nurse watching over me. Please thank her." Maya read the note, set it down, poured herself a cup of terrible break room coffee, and went back to work. Here is what this story is really about. It's not about a helicopter. It's not about military credentials or dramatic revelations. It's not even about Richard Calloway's apology. It's about the fact that Maya Torres was the same person before the apology as she was after it. She was the same person when Calloway dismissed her as she was when Reeves asked for her by name. The value was always there. The competence was always there. The quiet, extraordinary capability was always there. In the precise hands, the watchful eyes, the notes nobody read carefully enough. We live in a world that constantly asks people to prove themselves before offering them dignity. We rank. We assess appearances. We decide who deserves to be taken seriously based on how loudly they announce themselves. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes, the most extraordinary person in the room is the one nobody thought to look at twice. Maya never needed Calloway to see her. But the story asks us something. Think about the people in your life who work quietly, who never ask for recognition, who show up, do the work, carry more than anyone knows. Have you ever looked at them, really looked at them, and asked, what is this person's story? Tell me yours in the comments below.